Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, The Courageous Walk. I am Jacquelyn Reynolds, and today I have with you Jacquelyn McMillian-Bohler, who is a nurse midwife. And so she's going to start by telling us a little bit about her story, and then we'll get into conversation about women who are thinking about getting pregnant, if not now, later. So go on, Jackie, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I am delighted to be here and have this opportunity to talk with women out there. I've been a certified nurse midwife since 1997, and I have worked in South Carolina, on Johns Island. I have worked in Nashville, Tennessee, worked in Louisville, Kentucky, and through those experiences, I've taken care of women at all walks of life, every color, nationality, international, and I've had an opportunity to catch many babies, and we call it catching rather than delivering. Domino's delivers, we catch babies because our patients do the work. And so one of the things that draws me specifically to nurse midwifery is that idea of being with women. And that's actually what nurse midwife means. It means, or midwife means with woman. And so one of the things that I have grown and come to understand about my work is that my job is to be with women and be with families and help empower them towards making choices that make their lives what they wish for them to be. That's not a definition that I define. That's something that should be patient-centered and given to them. Where we've fallen short is that we've not necessarily given women the permission and the tools to speak for themselves, to actually know what it is they want and how they want to have it. So it's kind of not fair to say, well, you have a choice when you don't know what your choices are. So I take it, upon myself as an educator now to really tell my students that you've got to make sure that education is a focus of what you're doing so that patients can really make choices about their healthcare and we can provide patient-centered care. I've certainly in my life, I have two children, and I was a midwife at the time I had my children, so I had the benefit of my experience, but I know the vulnerability that it really you experience as a patient. And so it was still important for me, as educated as I was at the time, to have a provider that I trusted, to be able to have those experiences in childbirth classes. It wasn't that they were telling me something that I didn't know, but it was the experience that I needed to have that support. And I hope that for all women and that all families that, want to have those experiences have the ability to do that. So that's where I am. And I had a cancer scare in my life in my early 30s. And what I learned about that experience was that, that it was the support of my family and my friends that got me through that. And knowing, again, I was a provider, I knew what was wrong with me, but having education still, as from the perspective of the patient, is what made the difference about why I'm here today versus something else that could have happened.
Right. Well, we are grateful that you're here today. Well, thanks for sharing your story, some of it anyway. So in our conversations and preparing for this video really had to do with two parts, right? So women like myself who are in their late 30s and they hope to have a biological child at some point, but they're not, their situation does not allow for that yet. And for women who are actively trying to get pregnant, right? Like, what are the things that we should be doing and thinking about that we're probably not doing, or sometimes we start thinking about it too late, right? When we know for sure something's wrong.
So I'm going to say two things. And one thing I've already said, I'm just going to say again, because I can't express it enough, is that education is key. And every person should have an understanding of how their reproductive system works. So if you don't understand sort of the nuances of your menstrual cycle beyond that you have one or you don't, then that is going to be step one. Understanding that there is a timing, the way that your menstrual cycle happens every month or doesn't is an indication of what's going on within your system. Knowing that there are things that optimize your ability to conceive, things that get in the way of that. There are myths all over the place about what works and what doesn't, and those need to be dispelled. So my first piece of advice across the board is education. And so some of that it's open season on the internet. Some of it, which is what I would definitely recommend, is scheduling a visit with your reproductive provider to talk about your cycle, to talk about your plans to have children or to not have children, and what that looks like and what your options are. Because what we don't want is for you to be surprised when you get into your late 30s and maybe you have had other things come up, a career, just life, and it just has not happened that you want to have children, and then you find out in your late 30s that you are not in an optimal position to have children. If that's a choice you make, we want you to go into that knowing what your options are. And so if we don't ask questions and we don't take care of that in our early 20s, then we don't have options. So education is going to be key. Another thing is that we tend to wait too long when we're experiencing problems. So, the rule of thumb in terms of fertility, if you're under the age of really 30, 35, if it's taking you longer than 6 months to get pregnant, then you need to be going in to see your provider. So I am heartbroken when I hear of patients that have waited 2 and 3 years of actively trying to get pregnant before they come in, because time does not work in our favor in terms of conception. So getting those issues addressed early is going to be important. And so if you, and I would say that if you're in your 20s, we say a year. But I would say, after 6 months of really giving it an effort every month, it's time to just go in and have a conversation and have your menstrual cycle evaluated. Maybe it's your partner. It's not always the female in the interaction that's creating issues around fertility. So we want to make sure that we're addressing that as well.
So, we could use me as an example.
Okay.
So I am not I don't have a partner, so there's no way to actively try to get pregnant at this point.
Well, you can still be actively trying and not have a partner. That's still a possibility.
Well, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And in a pandemic, miss.
that may make it a little bit more difficult. I agree with that.
So I've been advised that for me, since, that's not on the radar right now, that I should freeze my eggs. Mm-hmm. But I was wondering, are there other things that specific things I could be thinking about? Because like you said, being up to date on your menstrual cycle and so on. What if you're on birth control, right? So then it's very consistent because the hormones are keeping it consistent. So, how do you, what are some of those things that I don't necessarily have control over, in the sense of, as opposed to there not being external hormones in my body dictating?
Mm-hmm. So there are blood values that we can draw to really get an idea of what your ovaries look like. There are ultrasounds that can be done to give us an indication. Sometimes we may suggest changing your birth control to something that is less hormonally related, so that we can actually see what's going on with your cycle. That may be another possibility. But other factors in terms of, diabetic states or weight or things like that can affect your menstrual cycle, how much you're exercising, those kinds of things can have some impact on that. And so going to the provider and looking at all of the things that can contribute to your fertility would be important. Also thinking about other health conditions that hopefully you know about, but some patients don't. Your sickle cell status. So what does that look like? So things that may lead to complications during pregnancy. We know that there are some definitely physical issues that go into it. We also understand the impact of stress on your menstrual cycle, and therefore your stress potentially on your ability to conceive, your ability to deliver a term pregnancy versus a preterm pregnancy. Those are going to be things that may be able to be changed, corrected, prevented if we take care of them on the front end rather than waiting. We know from statistics that, we have a much, much, much greater chance of dying in childbirth as Black women. We have a much greater chance of delivering a baby that is preterm, and a preterm baby, even though they're smaller. And I've had some patients say things like, well, a smaller baby's easier to deliver vaginally. And that's true. But the flip side of that is that a smaller baby is not going to be as developed in terms of lungs, not going to be as neurologically developed, and may have trouble eating, maintaining their temperature. And we know that the number one cause of death for babies is preterm. So if we want to make sure that we have better pregnancy outcomes. We want to deliver at term, and we want to be as healthy as possible. So issues like preeclampsia, or you might have heard it called toxemia, are going to be less likely to occur. The other issue, certainly under the stress sort of category, is this idea of how racism impacts our pregnancy outcomes. And that's something that, we are not necessarily in control of and being able to address that. But we need to make sure that we understand that those biases exist in healthcare, and that one of the things that makes that an issue is not being heard by our provider. So going back to that idea of choosing a provider with whom you can form a relationship with, that knows what your wants, desires, that listens to you when you say that you're experiencing some complications or problems, and someone that you're willing to be open and vulnerable with to share that, so that we can get on top of that.
Absolutely. So, so do you think that it's a good idea to have your eggs frozen? When is too late?
You have to have eggs. So I think the timing of that is going to be different for every person. And so the interesting thing about eggs in general is that we're born with all the eggs we're ever going to have. We don't make more. So we're not like chickens, and we don't make more eggs. They're actually in your ovaries. They're sort of dehydrated is a better way to sort of kind of give you a visual of that. And so every month we have certain eggs that are matured, and hopefully just one of them will be available for you to actually conceive. But those numbers go down. So we've actually, before we're ever born and cry our very first cry, half of our eggs are already gone. And so how many eggs you have are going to be person to person dependent. So you may run out of eggs when you're 30. You may run out of eggs when you're 28. You may not run out of eggs until you're 45. Those are all possibilities, and they're different depending on who it is. So that's why if you are not you're in a relationship or have not made the decision to look for other ways to conceive in your early 30s, that is a conversation that would be worth having with your GYN to sort of create a plan. You don't necessarily have to make a decision that day, but create a plan.
Okay. Chop, chop, John L. Chop, chop. Would you recommend just trying to meet with like a fertility specialist? Like for me, going straight to that, or do I need to like go through your gynecologist and then go through that process?
That's going to depend on your insurance. So some insurance will pay for those visits depending on what state you're in and that sort of thing, and some won't. Some basic infertility issues you should be able to talk about with your provider that provides your reproductive care. So that could be your OBGYN, your nurse practitioner, your nurse midwife, your physician's assistant, whomever you see should be able to provide some basic information. But I would recommend that if you're over the age of 35, if you feel like that is something that you're really concerned about, I would try to schedule that visit pretty soon. Now, many REIs will have consultation workshops or something like that as a part of their practice in order to get people to come that you may be able to join that may not be a charge, or they may have a consultation visit that is not charged for you to come in to ask some basic questions. But after 35, I would definitely think maybe lean more towards going to see a reproductive endocrinologist, which is REI, what that stands for, sooner rather than later.
Okay. As you were talking about other factors that could inhibit, like this is almost like a consultation for John L. But I also have scoliosis, the S shape. So I remember when I was diagnosed as a late teen, the orthopedic doctor said that before I considered, getting pregnant and so on, I needed to go get a checkup to see like the state of like my back and the organs and so on. So I feel like there's multiple steps and barriers too that could potentially make this an even more difficult process than it is for some other women.
Mm-hmm. Maybe or maybe not. So you've been walking around with that idea that there may be some complications related to your scoliosis for however long that's been, and that may or may not be the case. And so just as likely as there are things that may be concerns that need to be addressed, there may be things you're worrying about that really are not a problem. So I think you have to think about that visit in a twofold way to address things that need to be and allay fears that are really unfounded. So we want to think about evidence and using that to guide what we do or don't do or how we feel about things.
Right. So that was very helpful for myself. And so, okay, so I have friends and colleagues who are, in the space of actively trying and it's not working. And, but there's this additional societal pressure, right? On, especially if you've been married for a while, people are like, when are you going to have that baby? There's lots of questions. And, from my conversations with them, there's a bit, they feel overwhelmed. There's guilt and shame. There's all of these things, so when you're meeting with, patients, clients, what do you call them? Patients that are,
depends on what's going on. I usually just say clients. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Mm-hmm. As a clinician, we say clients. So I was like, like what are some, for the women that are actively trying, they're meeting with their doctors and they're, trying to figure out what's the best method or solution for their bodies and their relationships and so on. But there's all these other factors that are playing into people pressuring, right? What's some advice that you would give to them?
I think in terms of dealing with things like pressure and stigma, those are real. And your provider that you see for your sort of physical challenges that you have may not be able to address those things that are going on from a psychological standpoint. So there are counselors out there that are specifically specialized in working with clients who are dealing with infertility issues. And the reason for that is because that is a real issue and a real challenge. So again, fertility can wreak havoc on a relationship with someone else. And for all kinds of reasons, I've seen couples actually have dissolved relationships because of their inability to sort of work through those challenges. So that lets you know that that's a real thing. So I definitely, and many REIs will recommend as a part of their practice that couples and patients seek, or clients seek, some sort of additional psychological services to help them work through some of those challenges. So I don't have that in my particular wheelhouse as expertise, but I will tell you that I do see value in clients that choose to go that route to help work through those, because those are real challenges.
Absolutely. So we talked about stress, medical conditions that could be a barrier or inhibit your ability to get pregnant. Mm-hmm. There's also things that affect your DNA that are, coming down ancestral wise. Mm-hmm. There's also racism, mm-hmm. right? And these other societal implications that cause trauma to our bodies. Some of the other things that you talked about, some of this is from our pre-conversation, but I like that you had mentioned self-care. And a lot of times, especially on the internet, when we hear self-care, it's about soaking in a tub, going to a spa. Is that your definition of self-care in terms of preconception, pre-pregnancy, or do you have more?
There's definitely more to it. Self-care is whatever it is that you need to get you to a place where you can connect with yourself. And for some people, that's meditation, which doesn't cost anything. You don't have to go anywhere special. You can sit outside. Sometimes you can just sit in your closet. Sometimes in our household, there's so much chaos going on. The only place you can go and be quiet is inside your closet. Close the door. So it's really just about giving yourself space to do something that gets your mind off of the sort of the race of the day, the race of the stress of the things that we have to do. And that can be exercise, that could be reading a book, that could be just being quiet and being still. Maybe it's attending church or praying or whatever it is that you do. That's not defined by someone else, that's defined by you. So for some people, exercise is something that helps them to meditate. For some people, exercise is something they have to do to keep their blood pressure down, but it doesn't really help them relax the way that other things would. And so you've got to really do some thoughtfulness about what's going to help you feel better, because things like having a high blood pressure can certainly affect pregnancy outcomes. And that blood pressure might be related to the racism that's out there and all the other things that are going on in the world, but it may be related to things that are closer to you. Could be related to relationships that you're in, with your significant other, with your family, with your children, with friends. Those things can contribute to elevations in pressure and changes in all kinds of other systems in your body, because you actually physically release chemicals when you're under stress that changes the way that your body responds to all kinds of things. So it's an important issue.
Absolutely. And there was one other thing that we had talked about. You called it girl talk, but the types of conversations that you're having with other women,
Mm-hmm.
and how that may or may not be helpful.
Mm-hmm. So I can say that I have some friends that tell it to me straight. I have some friends that like to give me advice that I may or may not take. And then I have friends that agree with everything I say, no matter what I say, because that's where they are. And so you've got to really be thoughtful about who you're asking advice from, and who you are listening to, and where they get their advice from, because there's Facebook or fake book that's out there. And sometimes there are things that they look really great. They're just not true. There are people that don't have your best interest at heart, people that just frankly don't know what's really going on. And so if that's where you're getting your information from, and that's the only source, then that may be leading to some decisions that are not correct, and maybe actually harmful to you. So you want to make sure that your village is one that offers you support, that gives you advice that is correct, and that you respect yourself in terms of knowing. I mean, we all know who those friends and who those people are. So be thoughtful and be respectful of yourself enough to make those decisions, to be with people who can give you the support and information that's correct and honest.
Absolutely. So is there anything else any final words in terms of those who are like myself, wanting to have a child at some point, and those who are actively trying, that we should, lasting words of comfort and encouragement?
I would say that you need to make sure you've got a relationship with some kind of healthcare provider, and don't take the weight of having to figure everything out on your own. There are preconception visits where you can just go in and talk about where you are, and you don't have to wait until you're actively trying to have a baby to have that visit. You can schedule it in your 20s and say, you know what, I don't want to have children right now, but I think, when I meet the person, or maybe I don't want to meet anybody, I know, decide I want to have, reproductive services, and I'm going to do it myself. And that's an option too. Right. But to have those kinds of conversations, so that you can make the choice that you want. And once you're pregnant, making sure that you're educated not only about the process of having the baby, but what happens when you take that little one home. That I encourage breastfeeding, and if you don't know much about it, there are classes available for you to take, so that you can learn about that, but also that you just learn about what your options are to do all the things that you know of, and probably some things that you don't know about that are out there for you. Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Jackie. This was a wonderful conversation, and I felt like you helped me personally with a side consultation right here. Well, thank you, everyone. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow so that you won't miss any new videos that come up.